The clock read 6:45 a.m. as Jamal Carter parked his car in the lot outside the county courthouse in Burlington, Vermont. The chilly fall sunlight cast faint shadows across the pavement, and Jamal exhaled deeply. He hated being late. As a public defender, his professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness, but today, life had conspired against him. His heart raced from the morning's chaos. A spilled coffee, a jammed printer, and a call that had him pacing his apartment. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. The task ahead was mundane, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him. The city had raised the taxes inexplicably, and Jamal had spent weeks gathering proof that it was a mistake. The house was more than property to him. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye. Dressed in a charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt, Jamal looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was, even if his morning had been far from smooth. An urgent phone call about an ongoing juvenile justice case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Jamal couldn't ignore it. "You're our best shot, Jamal," his colleague had pleaded over the phone. "This kid's future is on the line." He had reviewed the motion and provided feedback to his team before rushing to call, knowing he was cutting it close. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance showed a message from his assistant at the public defender's office. "The judge in Burlington has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful." Jamal sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. "Tough doesn't scare me," he muttered, but his pulse quickened. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. But something in the message lingered. He shook it off as he stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The municipal court wasn't like the district courts where Jamal spent most of his days. The walls were a dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use. The air smelt faintly of coffee and old paper. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Jamal checked his watch. 6:53 a.m. 7 minutes to spare. Barely enough time to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people speaking in hushed tones. Room 306, Judge William Hargrove, was etched in brass on the door. Jamal adjusted his tie and stepped inside. His stomach tightened as he scanned the room, sensing the weight of judgment already hanging in the air. The courtroom was already filling with people. Jamal found a spot near the back and sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence. As he scanned his notes, he noticed the judge entering the room. Judge William Hargrove, a tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without saying a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he scanned the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room shuffled to its feet. Jamal joined in, his posture straight as the judge settled into his chair. Jamal noticed the stark silence that followed. Judge Hargrove began calling cases one by one with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Jamal watched closely. A middle-aged man in a suit, arriving a few minutes late, shuffled into the room unnoticed. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes slipped in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Jamal's jaw clenched. Why were they spared? Jamal made a mental note, but focused on his own case. Finally, at 7:10 a.m., Jamal heard his name called. He gathered his folder and made his way to the podium, projecting calm despite the slight delay. As he approached, Judge Hargrove looked up, his expression hardening. Jamal felt the shift in the room, a quiet tension that hadn't been present for the previous cases. "You're late, Mr. Carter," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Jamal raised his hand slightly, palms out in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent public defense matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Jamal interjected, his voice steady but firm, "I was ensuring a young client's rights were protected. Isn't that the kind of priority this court values?" Judge Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his face reddening. "Don't lecture me on values, Mr. Carter. Your job is to show up on time, not to play hero." Jamal felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He maintained his composure, choosing his next words carefully. Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment. Judge Hargrove waved a hand dismissively. We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $1,000, 0 cents. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking an anvil. Jamal's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Murmurs erupted, louder now, as spectators exchanged glances. Around him, murmurs rippled through the room. Your Honor, Jamal began, his tone calm and measured. May I explain? The judge raised his gavel, silencing him. You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court. A lesson for whom, Your Honor? Jamal pressed, his voice rising slightly. I've seen others walk in late today without so much as a word. Why am I the only one facing this? The room froze. Judge Hargrove's gavel hovered, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Jamal stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness, it was about something deeper, something that many in the room had likely seen before. He'd glanced briefly at the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring, and Jamal wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seats, Jamal opened his folder, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. He began jotting notes, his pen moving swiftly across the page. This isn't over, he whispered to himself, his resolve hardening. The judge, meanwhile, continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Jamal knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary morning. Jamal sat in the back row, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. The courtroom proceeded in its rhythm, but Jamal couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment Judge Hargrove imposed the $1,000, 0 cents fine, contrasting it with the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who had slipped in earlier sat near the front, scrolling on her phone, untouched by reprimand. A man in a grey blazer, now presenting his case, had clearly walked in after the judge began, yet the gavel's ire had been reserved solely for Jamal. It's not just me, Jamal thought, his eyes scanning the room. This is a pattern, and I'm going to prove it. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern Jamal could recognize as plainly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal instincts, assessing the situation with precision. A fine this steep for tardiness in municipal court was extreme, even punitive. He noted the expressions of those around him, a mix of disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity. Jamal could tell that others in the room were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak. Next case, Judge Hargrove announced. Jamal's name echoed in the room again. He stood, his stride calm and deliberate as he returned to the podium. The judge fixed him with the same piercing gaze, as if daring him to falter. Jamal began, Your Honor, I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values. He placed the folder on the podium, opening it to reveal neatly organized documents and photographs. He gestured toward a specific page. This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment, however, reflects a 40% increase without proper notification or explanation. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. I'll review it in due time, Mr. Carter. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your public defense responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court? I believe justice justifies my actions, Your Honor. Jamal replied, his voice unwavering. I was fighting for a child's future. If that's not worth a few minutes, what is? The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't waver. Your theatrics won't sway me, Mr. Carter. Rules are rules. Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't the words themselves that struck Jamal. It was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional achievements, his character, even his effort to respect the system, none of it mattered in this room. Jamal took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A ripple of unease passed through the room. The judge stiffened, the color in his face deepening. Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Carter? I'm questioning fairness, Your Honor, Jamal said, his voice cutting through the tension. If justice isn't blind here, what are we even doing? I'm asking for clarity, Jamal replied, his tone even. It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone here. The judge's gavel came down sharply. Enough! You're treading on dangerous ground, Mr. Carter. I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands. Jamal inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He paused, locking eyes with the judge for a fleeting moment, a silent promise that this wasn't the end. He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. He could sense the quiet admiration of some and the trepidation of others. This wasn't the first time Jamal had encountered bias cloaked in authority. But something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for what he would do next. Jamal pulled out his phone discreetly, typing notes. This is bigger than me, he typed, his fingers flying. This is for everyone who's been silenced here. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. He made a quiet decision then and there. This situation wouldn't end here. The courtroom continued its routine, but Jamal's presence had already shifted the atmosphere. Others noticed it too. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Jamal a brief, knowing glance. The court clerk, her fingers flying over the keyboard, occasionally hesitated, her discomfort visible. When the session ended, Jamal lingered for a moment as people filed out. He observed the way they carried the unspoken weight of what had transpired. A young law student sitting in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression one of awe and determination. Jamal left the courthouse with his briefcase in hand, his thoughts already forming a plan. They think a fine will shut me up, he thought, his resolve steeling. They're about to learn who I am. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment or even the fine. This was about something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. As Jamal exited the courthouse, the crisp air outside offered no relief from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse buzzed with the mundane movements of everyday proceedings, but inside Jamal's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant at the public defender's office. No, he muttered to himself. Not yet. He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Hargrove's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't incidental, it was structural. Jamal's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment. Back in his car, Jamal opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The public defender's emblem, embossed in silver, reflected the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He held it tightly, whispering, "Grandma, this one's for you." He decided this would be the first move. By the time he re-entered the courtroom, most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained, flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Hargrove was leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly tired. Jamal walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification in hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk raised her eyes, her fingers pausing mid-tape. Judge Hargrove glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. "Mr. Carter, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment," the judge said curtly. "With respect, Your Honor," Jamal began, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He held his badge up slightly, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the room. "I'm Jamal Carter, Senior Public Defender for Burlington County. I've been with the office for over 14 years, focusing on cases of juvenile justice, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands stilling over the papers he was handling. The color drained from his face as Jamal's words registered. Around the room, the remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "I was late this morning because of an urgent case requiring my immediate attention," Jamal continued, his tone firm but respectful. "A case that could have changed a young life forever. I'd make the same choice again. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're out of line, Mr. Carter," Hargrave snapped. "This court doesn't answer to you." "It answers to justice, Your Honor," Jamal countered, his voice steady, "and I'm here to make sure it's served." Mr. Carter, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning, Jamal replied, holding up his notebook. Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair, clearly uneasy. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Carter? I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor, Jamal said calmly. As a public defender, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns. The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Jamal and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was furiously jotting notes, her eyes wide with fascination. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels. Jamal placed his badge and identification on the podium. I intend to, Your Honor, but I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. Judge Hargrove shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He'd presided over this courtroom for decades. His authority rarely questioned so directly. For the first time, it seemed his confidence faltered. You may go, Mr. Carter, the judge said, his voice quieter now. Jamal collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering one final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly. He paused at the door, turning back. And I'll be watching, Your Honor. We all will. As Jamal walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that too often failed to see its own flaws. Outside, Jamal pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to his office. He included every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. This is the fight we've been waiting for, he typed, his heart pounding with purpose. By the time he hit send, he knew this was only the beginning. The email Jamal sent that afternoon moved faster than he anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the public defender's office. His supervisor, Lila Morgan, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, spoke with a mix of urgency and intrigue. Jamal, I read your report, she said. If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does, Jamal replied. I felt it in that room, Lila. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter. What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Lila exhaled sharply. I'll reach out to the State Judicial Review Board. This needs to be handled delicately, but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready. The call ended, but Jamal's work was just beginning. He spent hours piecing together every detail from the municipal court session. He combed through public records, noting inconsistencies in fines and penalties issued by Judge Hargrove. Patterns began to emerge. Fines for minor infractions were significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. Jamal reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Hargrove's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories of disparate treatment flooded in, some whispered in confidence, others offered with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses received only a small fee. Another described how the judge often interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases. Within days, the State Judicial Review Board initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators descended on the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Ellis, proved to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. These are notes I've been taking, she confessed. I've seen it for years, Mr. Carter. I wrote it down because I knew someday someone like you would come along. Every time something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore. The notes painted a damning picture. Dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment were meticulously recorded. Investigators also spoke with Henry Brooks, the longtime bailiff in the courtroom. He shared his observations with quiet conviction. "I've been here 16 years, Brooks said. "I've watched good people get crushed by this system, and I'm done staying quiet. I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, the story began to leak into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed the exchange in the courtroom posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it gained traction, sparking outrage and a flood of similar testimonies. The headlines followed soon after. "Bias in Burlington courtroom. Public defender challenges judge's conduct." News outlets picked up the story, and Jamal found himself at the center of a growing storm. Calls from reporters came non-stop, but he chose to remain focused on the investigation. The mounting pressure began to take its toll on Judge Hargrove. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately he began to realize the gravity of the situation. By the end of the first week, Jamal received a call from Lila. "The findings so far are staggering," she said. "The numbers don't lie, Jamal. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. It's systemic." "What's the next step?" Jamal asked. "We're taking this to the State Judicial Board, and Jamal, the media's not going to let this go. Be prepared." Jamal nodded to himself, even as a wave of exhaustion hit him. "I'm ready, Lila. This is what I've been fighting for my whole career." This was bigger than he had imagined, but he had no intention of backing down. The story of Jamal's encounter with Judge Hargrove had spread far beyond Burlington. By the end of the second week, national media outlets picked up the case. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Unveiled," "Public Defender Takes a Stand" dominated the news cycle. Social media hashtags such as "Fair Courts Now" and "Stop Court Bias" trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. Jamal remained focused, working with the State Judicial Review Board to consolidate evidence. The findings were devastating. Over the past 7 years, Judge Hargrove had fined black defendants an average of 400% more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants often went unmentioned, while black defendants faced reprimands or steep fines. Even requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just statistical, it was deeply human. Former defendants came forward, some publicly, others anonymously, to share their stories. A black mother recounted being fined $700, 0 cents, for contesting a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge had humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant minutes later. Local activist groups joined the fray, organizing rallies and calling for accountability outside the Burlington courthouse. Protesters held signs reading "Justice should be blind" and "End bias now." Jamal avoided the public spectacle as much as possible, but he couldn't ignore the significance of what was unfolding. Inside the courthouse, the pressure mounted. Staff members who had worked under Judge Hargrove for years began sharing their own observations. Mrs. Ellis, the clerk, became a key figure in the investigation. Her detailed notes, combined with court records, painted a comprehensive picture of bias that spanned decades. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said during one interview with investigators. "But you, Mr. Carter, you gave me the courage to speak. But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." Even Henry Brooks, the bailiff, spoke up publicly in a statement to the commission. "I've seen this kind of treatment for years," he said. "It's eaten at me seeing folks like you, Mr. Carter, get targeted. I'm with you now. It's wrong, and it's long past time for something to be done." Judge Hargrove, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. While he initially dismissed the accusations as misinterpretations, the mounting evidence forced him into damage control. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. The press tore into him, calling it a hollow apology, and Jamal's name became a rallying cry. The words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof to the contrary. Jamal, though inundated with attention, stayed grounded. He continued his work as a public defender, knowing that his responsibilities extended beyond this case. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the messages pouring into his office. Emails, phone calls, and letters came from across the country. some offering support, others sharing similar stories of bias in other courtrooms. One particularly moving letter came from a retired attorney in Maine. "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement grew beyond Burlington. Other judges in Vermont faced scrutiny as activists and reporters began digging into court records. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a broad review of municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias. By the end of the month, the State Judicial Review Board completed its preliminary report. The findings were damning, and the implications were clear. Judge Hargrove's actions were part of a larger, deeply embedded problem. The report called for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. The pressure became too much for Judge Hargrove. Faced with the prospect of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, he announced his resignation. In a brief statement, he said, "I believe it's in the best interests of this court and this community that I step aside." The news hit like a bombshell, with Jamal's supporters celebrating outside the courthouse. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as an admission of guilt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward healing. For Jamal, it was a moment of vindication, but not celebration. "This isn't the end," he told Layla later that day. "It's just the spark. The resignation was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead." As reforms began to take shape, Jamal found himself in a new role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences about his experience and the importance of challenging systemic bias. His story inspired young lawyers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, to see themselves as agents of change. At one such event, a young black law student approached Jamal after his speech. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules, it's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Jamal smiled, humbled by the words. "The fight is just beginning, but if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 4 months after the morning that set everything in motion, the courthouse in Burlington looked markedly different. The tired beige walls were repainted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors as they entered. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they hadn't known were available before: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. A small but meaningful plaque had been installed near the entrance: "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courthouse, changes were even more pronounced. Judge Hargrove was no longer presiding, having quietly left the bench following his resignation. In his place, a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality had taken over. More importantly, systemic reforms were already underway. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training, led by experts who tackled the subtle ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Jamal stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes that had been implemented. As he waited for his turn, he felt a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. He touched the framed fine on his office wall in his mind, a symbol of the battle he'd fought. Change had begun, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The reforms extended far beyond Burlington. Inspired by Jamal's actions, other communities in Vermont and eventually across the country began re-evaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes, with particular attention to racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants were established to monitor court proceedings and ensure accountability. In Jamal's office, the momentum was palpable. His fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Below it was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Jamal couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds. In the community, the ripple effects were equally significant. Henry Brooks, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Hargrove, was now leading bias training sessions for court officers. At one of his sessions, he addressed a room filled with new hires. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he said. "It's to honor folks like Jamal Carter, who stood up when it was hard. It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Ellis, the court clerk whose records had been instrumental in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly, mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. "You've changed everything, Mr. Carter," she told him one day, tears in her eyes. "I'm proud to be part of this now." Jamal's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Jamal thought for a moment before responding. "Listen to each other. To the people who come through our courts and to those who are too afraid to speak up, listening is where real change begins." The changes weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined their authority, but the evidence was undeniable. Within a year, the data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences in Burlington's municipal court. Payment plans were approved more often, and defendants reported feeling treated with more respect. For Jamal, the most rewarding moments came from the people who approached him to share their stories. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that morning months ago returned to the courthouse to thank him. "I've been coming here for 41 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd die before I saw change. You're our voice, son. I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said enough. Thank you for giving us hope." One morning, Jamal received a letter in his office. It was from a young public defender in Boston who had read about his story and been inspired to start her own investigation into biases in her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line: "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Jamal read the letter twice before placing it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. He closed his eyes, picturing his grandmother's house, the place where this all began. It wasn't about him, never had been. This was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long, voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Jamal walked back into the courthouse where it had all begun. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part after his efforts. As he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. "Justice isn't just about laws," Jamal began. "It's about standing up even when the room is against you. It's about fighting for those who can't. It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was thunderous, but Jamal's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. And as he stepped down, he knew this was only the start of a much bigger fight. And he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction.